The god who got a day job. Apollo, Hermes, and the stolen cattle a god is born. And trouble follows you are lying still, your eyes soft, your thoughts drifting. Let us begin not with thunder or war, but with a quiet cave in Arcadia, where something rather inconvenient for the gods had just occurred. On the morning Hermes was born, the world kept spinning. The sun kept rising, driven by his half-brother Apollo. No lesson, no god foresaw how one tiny infant would spark an oddly pastoral squabble between the heavens. Maia, Hermes' mother, gave birth to him in silence, nestled deep in the cool shadows of a cave. She was a nymph, shy and gentle, one of the Pleiades, and she preferred solitude. But her son would be none of those things. Hermes didn't stay a newborn for long. According to ancient sources, including the Homeric hymn to Hermes, he sprang from his cradle within hours, full of curiosity and mischief. Barely blinking in the dim cave light, he crawled out, stood, and immediately set off toward Thessaly. His target? Apollo's sacred cattle. Now, this is the part that often goes unnoticed when people recount Olympian myths. The Greek gods, for all their lightning bolts and marital squabbles, had livestock, real animals grazing on real fields. Apollo, god of music, prophecy, archery, and the sun, also kept a herd of divine cattle, lowing and chewing the cud somewhere in the Thessalian plains. And these weren't symbolic cattle. No, these cows had hooves, horns, and presumably required grazing schedules. It was all quite literal. So why did a newborn Hermes make a beeline for these divine bovines? Perhaps it was a test. Perhaps it was instinct. Or maybe, just maybe, it was boredom. The myths aren't always clear on motive. Only result. By sunset, Hermes had stolen 50 of Apollo's sacred cattle. But theft wasn't the clever part. The clever part was how he did it. To avoid being tracked, Hermes reversed the hooves of the cows, making it seem like they'd walked in the opposite direction. He also wore sandals made from bark and wove them in such a way that his own footprints would be untraceable. For good measure, he drove the cattle backward tail first. All of this happened before he'd even seen his second sunrise. You might be wondering, where did he take them? Not far. He settled them in a hidden glade near Pylos, and then, as casually as one might tie their shoes, he sacrificed 2 of the animals to the gods, his first ritual act, and a significant one. Then Hermes returned to his cave, curled up in his cradle, and pretended he hadn't done a thing. Maia, who had been sleeping or pretending not to notice, said nothing. A typical day in mythic parenting. Apollo, however, was not pleased. He may have been a sun god, but he had a temper that could scorch the air. When he realized his cattle were missing, he did what any immortal might. He consulted an oracle. Strangely enough, even oracles hesitated to speak against Hermes. Still, Apollo eventually found the trail, or the lack thereof, leading him to that humble cave. Here is where the myth slows down. The confrontation is less about violence and more about irritation. Apollo storms in, demanding answers. Hermes, the baby, gurgles and claims he doesn't even know what a cow is. Apollo, not in the mood for comedy, drags him before Zeus. Picture it. Mount Olympus, thunderclouds idly drifting. The king of the gods seated high on a marble throne, and in front of him, Apollo golden, radiant, angry, and Hermes small, smug, wrapped in swaddling clothes. Zeus listens to Apollo's complaints, but instead of punishment, he chuckles. His youngest son has fooled the older gods, and Zeus, ever the opportunist, sees potential. Instead of scolding Hermes, he makes him promise to give back the cattle. Hermes, still cooing innocently, agrees. Now, this could have been the end of the tale, a quick, odd diversion in the early careers of the gods. But what followed was stranger still. When Hermes returned the cattle to Apollo, he offered something else: music. Specifically, the lyre, a musical instrument he had crafted out of a tortoise shell and sheep gut, an invention that would define Greek musical tradition for centuries. Apollo, surprisingly, was touched. His anger cooled, and in exchange for the lyre, he granted Hermes a place on Mount Olympus and gifted him the caduceus, the winged staff he would forever carry. He even entrusted Hermes with a role as messenger to the gods, a job requiring precision, speed, and no small amount of cleverness. This is the version most often told: the birth of Hermes, the theft of the cattle, and the uneasy truce that turned into a divine promotion. But there's an overlooked footnote. Some versions suggest that as part of his penance, Hermes made Apollo herd cattle for a while. Yes, the golden god of light, prophecy, and healing tasked with watching over mooing, grass-munching cows, and not just watching, herding, with a crook, on foot. Under the sun he himself controlled. It's a peculiar moment in mythology, not grand, not terrifying, just boring. In the best way. Imagine Apollo walking barefoot through pastures, swatting flies with a branch, occasionally tuning his lyre under a tree, perhaps even trying to compose a hymn to celebrate the bovine spirit, only to be interrupted by a wayward calf. This fragment of the myth never made it into many epic poems, but it lingered in oral tradition passed quietly among shepherds and rural priests who found humor in the irony. Here was a god, radiant and untouchable, momentarily forced into the slow rhythm of rural life. Each morning, he would rise not to shoot arrows or declare prophecy, but to check fences, count cows, and chase strays. His days became filled not with oracles, but with chewing, plodding, breathing animals. And over time, it's said Apollo began to understand them. Not just their habits, but their place. He listened to their sounds, the cadence of hooves on soil, the softness of their lowing. He noticed how cows always seemed to know where water was, how they avoided certain plants and gathered together. In shade when storms approached, the sun god learned patience, not from books or temples, but from the steady plod of hooves. Some scholars, especially in the late Hellenistic period, saw this episode as symbolic. They believed the myth wasn't about theft or punishment, but about empathy. That Apollo, a god of distant light, needed to be grounded. That in herding cattle, he learned what it meant to guide without force, to lead by presence, not power. And for Hermes, it was the perfect joke. He had tricked the gods, made music, and landed a prestigious job. Meanwhile, his brother had to spend days wiping mud off his ankles. The story ends, not with war or tragedy, but with understanding. Hermes and Apollo, opposites in many ways, became allies. And Apollo, humbled by cowbells and country air, would never again underestimate the power of boredom or of his little brother. Yet, this raises a quiet question that lingers like the scent of hay in a warm field. If even a sun god can be made to slow down, what did he truly see in the silence between? The lowing of cows? Apollo in the fields, a god among grazing things. The morning mist hung low on the hills, soft and slow, as though it too had nothing urgent to do. In the distance, a single cowbell chimed, the sound echoing gently across the Thessalian plains. Somewhere in that stillness, Apollo stood, squinting toward a wandering calf and trying to remember, again, how many he was supposed to be watching. You may think of gods as above it all, but ancient Greek mythology never hesitated to remind its listeners that even immortals had chores, setbacks, and sometimes mildly humiliating tasks. Apollo's brief time as a cattle herder was not punishment in the lightning bolt and fury sense. It was quieter than that, stranger than that, and perhaps more meaningful than the myths ever gave it credit for. There are few surviving details about Apollo's time with the cattle. No grand epic catalogues his experience. No temple inscriptions declare, "Here stood Apollo, caretaker of hooves." But fragments of the story survived in whispers, tucked into rural hymns and passed among shepherds and travelers. They were tales not of heroism, but of patience, routine, and the subtle taming of pride got in the version told in Arcadian hill villages. It was said that after Hermes returned the stolen cattle, Apollo was given guardianship over them for a season not forever, but long enough to learn something he didn't yet know. The gods, after all, were immortal, but not all-knowing. Some things had to be lived. The days followed a rhythm. Wake at dawn. Guide the cattle from their pen. Watch them graze. Nudge them away from rocky ledges or sour plants. Lead them to water. Count them. Count them again. And again. At first, Apollo was exasperated. He who could bend time, speak prophecies, and summon plagues, now found himself shouting at stubborn oxen and tripping over low brambles. He had known grandeur, temples, full of smoke and song. Now he knew cow pies and sunburn. But soon, a shift. It began, perhaps, when he realized the cattle had their own system. They moved in patterns, not chaos. When one walked, others followed. When the lead cow stopped, the rest grazed calmly. There was a rhythm to their chewing, a pattern to their steps. Apollo, ever the god of music, began to notice the melody in the mundane. He brought his lyre with him, of course. At first, he played out of boredom. But then, something changed. He noticed the cattle responded. Not in dramatic ways. This wasn't a fairy tale, but in quiet signs. A slower flick of the tail. A pause. A head lifted. The music, gentle and steady, seemed to calm them. So he began composing new melodies, not for people, not for Olympus, but for cows. He played while they grazed, experimenting with tempo and tone. These were not heroic ballads or love songs. They were soft, looping melodies, repetitive, dull, even, but the kind of dull that seeps in and smooths the edges of thought. Like the feel of warm sun on your neck. In these long afternoons, Apollo also noticed the world itself more, the land, the wind, the way light filtered through olive leaves, the shift of shadows across the soil, things a god of the sun should know, but rarely had time to observe. The cattle taught him something about presence. Unlike humans, who constantly yearned, prayed, begged, asked questions, the cows simply were. They chewed, they wandered, they slept. They lived fully in each moment, with no expectation of tomorrow or regret of yesterday. And that's where Apollo's frustration softened into something else. He began speaking to them, not out loud, but through thought. Not as a god to beasts, but as one being to another. He started to see personalities. One calf always strayed. One cow liked to drink last. One old ox liked to lie beneath the same tree every afternoon, come wind or rain. He began naming them. Not with grand heroic names, but simple ones. Spot, whistle, tumble, grayback. The act of naming made the work feel less like punishment and more like care. And with care came understanding. There's a saying that humans domesticated animals. But perhaps Apollo began to suspect animals domesticated us just as much. The cow, in particular, was a creature of patience. It offered milk, labor, warmth, and companionship. It asked little in return. Its presence had shaped villages, diets, and rhythms of life. And now it was shaping a god. One story, told only in an obscure Delphic scroll, claimed that during this time, a mortal herder once approached Apollo, not recognizing him. The man had lost a calf and asked if Apollo had seen it. Apollo, amused, responded not with divine wisdom, but with practical advice. Calves like damp places. Look near the river shade where the grass is thickest. The man found the calf and returned, offering bread and honey as thanks. Apollo accepted it, not as a god, but as a fellow herder. A man lingered, and they spoke of weather patterns, hoof rot, and the best way to fix a broken fence. For a moment, the divine and the mortal stood level, not as worshipper and deity, but as workers sharing a task. And perhaps that was the lesson. Apollo, the shining god of far-reaching arrows, learned how to walk beside things, not ahead of them. He, who had always seen from above stars, fates, distant outcomes, began to see from the level of soil and hoofprint. Now, none of this stopped him from being a god. He still rose into the sky each day, dragging the sun behind him. But he did. So now, with a little more quiet in his heart, a little more earth under his fingernails. And Hermes? He watched it all with a grin. A young trickster, now fully ensconced in Olympus, had his own responsibilities: messenger, guide of souls, patron of travelers and thieves. But he never let Apollo forget that brief, humbling job among the cows. In fact, he'd often tease him at divine feasts. "Tell us again, brother," Hermes would smirk. "What did Spot do when you played in C minor?" Apollo, ever composed, would smile. She chewed more slowly. Laughter would ripple through the hall, and even Zeus would chuckle. But beneath the jesting lay respect. Apollo had taken his strange assignment, and without complaint learned from it. Over time, this tale faded. It wasn't grand enough for the tragedians. It lacked the blood and betrayal that filled the stage. But it endured in quieter places. In the sigh of cattle settling in for the night. In the hum of a lyre strummed by firelight. In the simple truth that even gods can be brought down to earth and find meaning there. Apollo would eventually return to Delphi, to prophecy, to glory. But something stayed with him. He began to speak more kindly to mortals. He played softer songs. And occasionally he would pause during his solar arc across the sky and glance down at a quiet pasture, just to make sure the cattle were doing all right. And perhaps, in those moments, one could say that the gods remembered what it was like to be close to the ground. Not above, not beyond, just with. But this leads to another gentle curiosity. Did Apollo, after all his return to Olympus, ever secretly miss the slow afternoons among the cows? The lyre, the staff, and the quiet legacy of boredom as time trickled. Forward like water slowly eroding marble, Apollo's days in the pasture became something like a forgotten dream. Not erased, not gone, but hazy. Olympus returned to its glittering routine. The hymns sung in his temples grew louder again. His hands, once calloused from leading cattle by rope, now strummed more refined melodies on the golden lyre that had become his signature. But something had shifted deep within him. Not dramatically, not in the fiery way myths often like to record transformation, but slowly, like the way sunlight inches over a sleeping valley. His time among cattle had left a subtle mark. Historians of mythology often brush past this part. Most jump straight to Apollo's later deeds, his role at Delphi, his prophecies, his many tragic love stories. But buried under those grand tales lies a thread so quiet, most never tug it. It is the thread of what happens when a god is made to slow down. After the cattle episode ended, Hermes and Apollo found themselves changed. They weren't close. In the brotherly sense, there were still sharp contrasts between them, but they began to understand each other in ways few gods ever managed. Hermes, for all his thievery and mischief, admired Apollo's grace and beauty. Apollo, in turn, recognized that Hermes was not merely a prankster, but a clever mind brimming with invention. In fact, their brief rivalry laid the foundation for something rare among the gods. Cooperation. It was after the cattle incident that Zeus, amused and perhaps impressed, officially assigned Hermes the role of divine messenger. That winged staff, the caduceus, was given not just as a symbol of speed, but of mediation. Hermes had smoothed tension between gods. He had turned theft into harmony. His caduceus, often misunderstood today, was originally the mark of someone who negotiated between opposites. And Apollo? He became not just a god of light and reason, but a patron of music with real empathy behind his songs. His tunes were no longer only about beauty, they carried stillness. They echoed with the rhythm of grazing animals and drifting. Clouds, the lyre he received from Hermes, was not merely an instrument, it was a reminder. A relic of an odd exchange. 50 sacred cattle, stolen and returned. In trade for the very sound of comb. Now, imagine Apollo returning to Delphi. The sanctuary nestled beneath Mount Parnassus welcomed him like a prodigal god. The Pythia, the oracle priestess, sat ready. Supplicants knelt. And yet, when Apollo opened his mouth to speak, his voice had changed. Not in tone, but in presence. Before the cattle, his words had been golden, yes, but distant. Beautiful, but abstract. Now there was a warmth to them, a slowness even. He no longer declared fate like a herald with a scroll. He spoke like someone who had once waited 3 hours for a calf to return from the wrong side of a ravine. The humans noticed. They may not have known about the cattle or the bargain with Hermes, but they saw something in his eyes. A weariness that wasn't weakness. A calm that wasn't detachment. They came to Delphi not just for prophecy, but for comfort. And slowly, across generations, Apollo's image evolved. He remained a god of light, yes, but not blinding light. A guiding one. Like dawn, not noon. It's curious, then, that the most humbling chapter of his divine life came not from war, nor heartbreak, nor cosmic failure, but from watching cows. Even centuries later, when Rome took up the Greek pantheon, when Apollo's name crossed seas and languages, little echoes of this story remained. In some rural shrines, offerings were made to him not in gold or polished marble, but in cheese, milk, and small wooden carvings of cattle. The elite scoffed, but the farmers remembered. They believed quietly, faithfully, that Apollo understood. There lives. That he knew what it meant to rise early, to count the herd, to pray for rain. Not because he had always been divine, but because he had once walked their fields. And the cows? Their place in myth is usually secondary. They are background, props, but in this strange tale, they are the teachers, the carriers of slowness, of rhythm, of routine. Their presence reminded gods, and perhaps remind us, that life's deeper truths are not always hidden in thunder or flames, but in repetition, in stillness, in the sound of chewing grass. When you think of the ancient world, you might think of temples and battles, but it was cattle that shaped settlement, that defined diet, that determined where villages could survive. The cow, steady and unimpressed by divine drama, was a cornerstone of daily life. Perhaps that's why this myth has survived, not loudly, not famously, but like an ember that never quite goes out. It offers something rare, a glimpse into the mundane life of immortals. It teaches that even gods needed reminders to be present. There's one last whisper of this story, found scratched into the side of an ancient drinking cup unearthed in Boeotia. Faded, but readable. It reads, "He who herded the sun once herded cows, and in their slow steps found peace." The phrase is unaccompanied by any author's name. Just that single line. As if someone, somewhere, wanted to remember, not the glory, but the stillness. And so, the next time you hear a cow lowing in the distance, or see one swaying under a tree, think of Apollo not in his golden chariot, but standing in a field, wiping sweat from his brow, humming a tune that no one else would ever hear. Not every myth ends in blood or betrayal. Some end in soft hooves, quiet hills, and a kind of boredom that changes a god. But that leaves one last question, perhaps. The most peculiar of all. If boredom could humble a god, What might it still be able to teach us? The woman who measured the world. How Eratosthenes calculated Earth's size with a stick. Section 1. Shadows, wells, and the first geometry of Earth in the quiet midday heat of ancient Egypt, under the heavy sun that painted sharp shadows on stone. A man sat pondering something most people never questioned: the shape of the Earth and its size. You might think this story begins with a discovery, a eureka, or a grand proclamation. But really, it began with boredom and a curious observation. And it wasn't a man who noticed it first, but a woman. At least, that's how some whispered traditions frame it. The records don't name her, but in the town of Sayinina, Aswan, some say there was a woman who told travelers, again and again, that at noon on a certain day of the year, the sun shone straight down into her well-dot, no shadow. Just a beam of light, so perfect it lit the water at the bottom like a coin. People thought it was neat, unusual, a fluke of location, perhaps. But to a man sitting hundreds of miles north in Alexandria, it was the seed of something much bigger. That man was Eratosthenes. He was a librarian by title, keeper of scrolls at the great library of Alexandria. But really, he was a generalist, a geographer, mathematician, poet, astronomer, and, as he would later be mocked for, a man second best at everything. The nickname given to him, Beta, the second letter of the Greek alphabet, was not meant kindly. Yet Beta saw things others did not. Eratosthenes had heard about the well in Syene, perhaps from traders, perhaps from sailors, perhaps even from that unnamed woman, if she ever visited the library. He learned that at noon on the summer solstice, the sun stood directly overhead. No shadows, not even under tall pillars. And that caught his attention, because in Alexandria, on that same day, at that same hour, there were shadows. If the earth were flat, this wouldn't make sense. The sun should strike every location the same way, at the same time. But it didn't, and in that sliver of discrepancy, Eratosthenes saw something extraordinary. So he decided to measure the earth, not with rockets, not with satellites, with shadows. The first step was to measure the angle of the shadow in Alexandria at noon on the solstice. He took a vertical stick, a gnomon, like the upright part of a sundial, and planted it in the ground. As the sun reached its highest point, he measured the length of the shadow it cast. Through basic geometry, he calculated the angle of the sun's rays. It came out to about 7.2 degrees, roughly 1/50th of a full circle. Now, here's where the simplicity becomes genius. If the sun's rays are hitting the earth in parallel lines, and they appear to, given how far away the sun is then, the difference in shadow between Alexandria and Syene meant that Earth itself must be curved. The arc between the two cities represented 1/50th of Earth's total circumference. Eratosthenes had a number. All he needed now was the distance between the two locations. But how do you measure miles in 240 CE? There were no satellites, no odometers, no highway signs. Instead, he relied on Bemetists' professional step counters. These were men trained to walk measured distances and count their paces with astonishing accuracy. Their estimations were often within a small margin of error, and their work helped armies and merchants navigate the vast territories of the ancient world. According to their data, Syene and Alexandria were approximately 5,000 stadia apart. The exact length of a stadion is debated, but using the commonly accepted value of about 157.5 meters per stadion, the distance would be roughly 787.5 kilometers. If that distance represented 1/50th of Earth's total circumference. Then multiplying it gave a total of 39,375 kilometers, astonishingly close to the modern figure of 40,075 kilometers. Let that sink in. Over 2,200 years ago, using a stick, a shadow, and some clever geometry, Eratosthenes calculated the size of our planet with less than a 1% margin of error. But here's what most people don't realize. No one asked him to do this. There was no king commissioning this project. No temple demanding a measure of the cosmos. No financial incentive. He did it because he was curious. Because a shadow on the ground didn't match a story from a well. And instead of dismissing it, he chased the discrepancy. This was not heroic in the cinematic sense. No danger, no battles. Just thought, method, and math. Yet it changed the way humans understood their place in the universe. And of course, not everyone believed him. While educated elites found his logic compelling, many remained skeptical. After all, his methods weren't flashy. His tools were basic. And his personality didn't help. Eratosthenes was not a smooth talker. He was awkward, prone to long-winded explanations. He liked numbers more than people, even in his own lifetime. Some scoffed at his results. Others, like the philosopher Hipparchus, refined them further. Still others, including Ptolemy centuries later, ignored them and reverted to a smaller Earth model. But the data Eratosthenes collected remained, and more importantly, his method endured. Centuries later, explorers, cartographers, and astronomers would revisit his work. When Magellan circumnavigated the globe, when Newton calculated gravity, when satellites first photographed Earth as a sphere, they were all knowingly or not following in the quiet, dusty footsteps of a man who once measured shadows at noon. It's tempting to romanticize it all. To picture Eratosthenes standing under a bright Egyptian sun, hand shielding his eyes, his robe catching the desert breeze as he draws angles in the dirt. But really, it was probably hotter than he liked. The sand was in his sandals. And he had to squint a lot. Boring, really. And that's the beauty of it. This wasn't a moment of divine inspiration. It was a slow, deliberate act of observation. A recognition that even in the most ordinary phenomena, the length of a shadow there, lies something profound. The modern world remembers him vaguely. A name in textbooks, a footnote in science history. His scrolls are mostly lost. His grave, like his life's details, unmarked. But his question remains alive. What else might we misunderstand just because we haven't bothered to measure? Section 2. Why the earth stayed round, but the world forgot, and yet the world did not change overnight. Eratosthenes had, through logic and patient observation, shown that Earth was a sphere, and not just that, but how big the sphere was. You might expect that such a revelation would spread like wildfire across the Mediterranean world, reshaping how people navigated, farmed, or worshipped. But it did single quotes t. In fact, after Eratosthenes' death, the very idea of a round Earth, while never completely abandoned, began to drift into the background. Not because anyone disproved it, but because it simply didn't feel relevant to daily life. You see, most people in the ancient world were not astronomers or philosophers. They were farmers, bakers, weavers, traders. Their relationship to the heavens came through myths, not mathematics. The curve of the earth didn't matter when you were focused on planting your barley in the right season or crossing the Aegean in a ship that hugged the coastline. Even within intellectual circles, Eratosthenes' work was met with polite silence. Some cited it, yes, but others ignored it entirely. And soon, new thinkers emerged with their own ideas not always based in observation. One of them was Claudius Ptolemy, writing in Alexandria some 4 centuries after Eratosthenes' death. Ptolemy was brilliant. He developed detailed models of the heavens, including the famous geocentric model in which Earth stood still at the center of the universe. His system explained planetary motion using epicycles and deference geometrical, tricks that matched observed data. But in order to make the math easier, Ptolemy decided that Earth must be smaller than Eratosthenes had said, much smaller. His estimate was around 28,800 kilometers in circumference, nearly 25% too short. Why did this matter? Because while Eratosthenes had used geometry to describe what was, Ptolemy shaped his model around what he needed to make the math work. And over time, people trusted the model more than the shadows. Then came centuries of turmoil. The Roman Empire fractured. Libraries burned. Scrolls were lost. And in the medieval period, especially in Western Europe, much of the mathematical knowledge of the Greeks and Egyptians went silent. But here's where things get interesting. Contrary to popular myth, most educated people in the Middle Ages did know the Earth was round. The idea of a flat Earth is largely a 19th century myth used to mock medieval thought. In truth, scholars in Byzantium and the Islamic world preserved and even expanded upon Eratosthenes' methods. Al-Biruni, an 11th century Persian scholar, used trigonometry and horizon measurements to recalculate Earth's circumference. His estimate? About 39,960 kilometers. That's within 1% of the modern value, remarkably close to Eratosthenes' own calculation made 1,300 years earlier. In the Islamic Golden Age, scholars across Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba copied Greek texts, debated them, refined them. They questioned Eratosthenes' assumptions, checked distances between cities using new star charts, and even improved the mathematics of angles and chords. And yet, his core idea that the Earth could be measured by simply comparing shadows remained. A pillar. A pillar. So why did Eratosthenes' method not lead directly to globe-spanning voyages? Why didn't ancient explorers circumnavigate the Earth based on his measurements? Because the world wasn't ready. There were no ships capable of sailing across open oceans for months. No compass. No accurate clocks to measure longitude. And frankly, no economic incentive to test whether Asia could be reached by sailing west. In fact, centuries later, it was Christopher Columbus who would famously miscalculate the size of the Earth, partly because he ignored Eratosthenes' correct estimate and accepted Ptolemy's smaller version. Had Columbus used Eratosthenes' math, he might never have sailed. The Pacific would have looked far too vast. Ironically, his lucky error led him to stumble across the Americas. But it was still Eratosthenes' ghost, his idea that shaped the modern age. In the 17th century. With the invention of more precise tools, scholars like Newton, Cassini, and Maupertuis returned to the Earth's size, not just to confirm its roundness, but to debate whether it was a perfect sphere or slightly flattened at the poles. Satellites in the 20th century would later confirm Earth is an oblate spheroid, just slightly squashed. And in the background, Eratosthenes waited patiently. No books of his survive completely. We know of his writings through fragments, summaries, and later citations. He wrote on geography, mathematics, and philosophy. He even developed a map of the known world, a map that in some ways was more accurate than many produced 1,000 years later. What's often overlooked is that Eratosthenes was not just a thinker, but a builder of systems. He created a method to calculate prime numbers, known as the sieve of Eratosthenes. He attempted to date major historical events. He even coined the word geography, geographia, the writing of the Earth. And yet, despite all this, he was known in his time not as a genius, but as a generalist. Beta. Second best at everything. Too philosophical to be a pure mathematician. Too mathematical to be a poet. Too curious to fit comfortably in one discipline. But maybe that was the point, because Eratosthenes didn't see knowledge as separate silos. He saw connections. A woman's story about a well, a stick's shadow, a step counter's estimate, a geometry theorem. From those scraps, he pieced together the true shape of the world. And he did it not for glory, or wealth, or divine favor. He did it because he noticed something odd and decided to measure. He died late in life, reportedly blind. There are rumors, though likely apocryphal, that he chose to starve himself, feeling that if he could no longer see or read, there was no point in going on. A melancholy and four. A man whose entire life was shaped by observation. But even if his eyes failed, his vision endured, because in the end, Eratosthenes gave us more than a number. He gave us a way to think that truth often lies not in spectacle, but in shadow. Not in epiphany, but in careful, quiet measurement. So the next time you stand outside at noon and see your shadow slant just slightly, think of him. And ask, what? Truths are still waiting, hidden in the angles we forget to measure? Section 3. The Lost Library, the Whispering Shadows, and the Legacy of Measurement. When Eratosthenes died, the earth did not grow flatter, nor did the shadows change their angle. But something did shift quietly, gradually, and then with a devastating finality. The Library of Alexandria, where Eratosthenes had calculated the earth's circumference, began to fade from its golden age. The very halls were ancient manuscripts, whispered truths across the centuries. Those same rooms began to grow silent. We do not know the exact moment the great library was destroyed. There were many events. Caesar's siege in 48 BCE, the Christian purges under Theophilus in the late 4th century CE, the Muslim conquest in 642 CE. No single event can claim full responsibility. And perhaps that's fitting, because knowledge does not often vanish in flame. It fades in disuse. It is misplaced, misunderstood, forgotten. And so too, for a time, was Eratosthenes. Centuries passed. His name would flicker now and then in copies of old Greek texts, footnotes in Arab treatises, margins of Latin scholastic commentaries. But the grandeur of his discovery was buried under layers of reinterpretation. And yet, something strange happened. Even as his name faded, his method endured. The Eratosthenian method, the shadow, the stick, the angles, the comparison would be rediscovered independently in multiple places. It became embedded in how early scientists and scholars thought about the Earth's shape. In the 9th century, under the rule of the Abbasid Caliph Al-Man, a team of scholars was tasked with measuring the Earth's circumference. They used a desert near Baghdad as their open-air laboratory. One team traveled north, the other south, using stars to determine latitude. They came up with a value that, depending on the conversion of their ancient units, was remarkably close to Eratosthenes' original estimate. They may have known his name, or maybe not. But his shadow lingered. By the Renaissance, as Europe rediscovered classical texts through the Arab world, scholars began to piece together the forgotten brilliance of ancient thinkers. Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo all worked in a world that was once again open to the possibility that knowledge could be rediscovered, remeasured, understood. It is ironic, then, that when Columbus set sail in 1492, he rejected Eratosthenes' measurement of the Earth's size. Why? Because Eratosthenes had made the Earth too big, at least for Columbus' ambitions. Using the smaller estimates by Ptolemy, Columbus believed Asia could be reached in a matter of weeks by sailing west. If he had trusted Eratosthenes, he would have realized that the ocean was far wider than he imagined, and perhaps he would never have dared the crossing. He was wrong, and lucky, because he ran into a continent he wasn't looking for. Eratosthenes, with his stick and his sun and his shadows, was right all along, but his truth was inconvenient. And inconvenient truths are often ignored until they are needed again. Let's shift now from numbers to perception. To measure the Earth is not merely to understand distance. It is to accept that the world has no edge, that you cannot fall off, that there is no end, only curvature. That is a profoundly unsettling idea. To many, flatness is simple. Boundaries are comforting. But curvature? That's a quiet reminder that we are always going in circles. That everything returns in that sense. Eratosthenes was not just a geographer. He was a philosopher of reality. He showed that the universe could be understood not through myth, but through method. Not through divine proclamation, but through patient observation. That's not exciting. It's not the kind of story that makes it into epic poems or legends. And yet, it's the foundation of all science. We live today in a world full of measurements. GPS signals bounce off satellites whose orbits were calculated using equations derived from Eratosthenes' same principles. Climate models depend on knowing how much solar energy strikes at tilted Earth. Satellites measuring sea levels account for Earth's curvature every second. The quiet shadow still shapes our reality. And yet, we forget. We forget that the ancients, in all their robes and sandals and scrolls, were capable of insights that we can barely replicate without computers. We forget that truth is often born not in brilliance, but in boredom, in the act of noticing something odd and refusing to let it go. Why did the sun cast a slightly different shadow in Syene than in Alexandria? That's not a question that would stop traffic. It wouldn't even start a conversation at a dinner party. But to Eratosthenes, it was a question that mattered. And that question led to a number that became a foundation for everything. From navigation to astronomy. So here we are, thousands of years later, still trying to measure our world. Still trying to understand it, chart it, name it. We send satellites to Mars and probes into interstellar space. We build particle colliders and map DNA. We point telescopes at galaxies whose light left them when Eratosthenes was still alive. And at the center of all, this is a simple truth. To know the universe, you must first measure it. And to measure, you must observe. And to observe, you must be still. Still enough to notice that one stick's shadow is not like another. Still enough to imagine what lies beyond the horizon. Still enough to ask, what angle does truth cast today? In closing, let us return to that summer solstice noon over 2,000 years ago in the sweltering silence of Alexandria. A man stood by a stick. A scribe marked the shadow. Another man recalled a well in Syene where the sun stood overhead. No thunder rolled. No angels sang. There was no applause. Just numbers, angles, a fraction of a circle. And from that, the size of the earth. Measured. Not with machines, but with curiosity. With discipline. With a question that refused to go unanswered. So if one day you feel overwhelmed by the complexity of our world, by the data, the maps, the models, the networks, remember that much of it began with a shadow, and the stubbornness to measure it. And perhaps the most powerful thing you can do is to notice something boring. Because, as Eratosthenes showed us, boring things, when seen the right way, can reveal the shape of the world itself. The temple of echoes, how the ancient Greeks measured sound without knowing it. Theme, acoustics, temples, and accidental science long before microphones, amplifiers, or audio engineers. There were temples, great stone halls, built not just to impress the gods, but curiously, built in such a way that a whisper could travel from one wall to the next with eerie clarity. It's easy to picture ancient Greek temples as static, silent ruins, columns crumbling under ivy, open to the ivy, wind and rain. But once these structures sang. They were designed for sound. Even if no one quite understood how. This is the story of how ancient architects, priests, and philosophers stumbled into one of the most peculiar sciences, acoustics, without knowing. They had done it, and at the heart of this tale lies a theater carved into a hillside in a quiet city named Epidaurus. The theater of Epidaurus was built in the 4th century BCE. nestled into a slope of pine-covered hills in the northeastern Peloponnese. It could hold up to 14,000 spectators, each seated on curved stone benches that fanned out like ripples in a pond. Even today, its acoustics are legendary. Tour guides routinely drop a coin at center stage, and visitors seated at the very top over 60 rows up can hear it land on the limestone floor. A whisper, a soft breath, a gentle scrape of sandal across stone. It carries effortlessly. How? That question puzzled visitors for centuries. Was it the perfect geometry? The materials? Some lost technique? Or something else? Something more mysterious? Let's step back. Imagine Epidaurus not as a ruin, but as a living, breathing sanctuary. This was no ordinary city. It was a healing center dedicated to Asclepius, the god of medicine. Pilgrims came from across the Mediterranean seeking cures for ailments. They brought offerings, dreams, prayers, and in return, they received rituals, rest, and sometimes stories of miraculous recovery. The theater was part of the experience, not merely for entertainment, but for spiritual therapy, music, poetry. Drama all were believed to restore harmony to the soul. And harmony, as the Greeks knew, required balance. In mathematics, in health, and in sound. But here's the twist. While the ancient builders did not understand acoustics as we do today, had no concept of sound waves or frequencies, they observed patterns. And like all good observers, they built with those patterns in mind. Stone reflected sound better than wood. Slopes carried voices better than flat ground. Curved surfaces caught echoes. Narrow passages funneled noise like rivers. Through centuries of trial, error, and above all, listening, they constructed a theater that didn't just host sound, it sculpted it. Modern researchers have tried to reverse engineer the genius of Epidaurus. One study found that the seats themselves, carved from limestone, acted as natural acoustic filters, dampening low-frequency background noise and enhancing human speech frequencies. Another theory points to the inclination of the seating rows, which minimizes reflection distortions and channels direct sound upward. The orchestra pit, too, plays a role in radiating sound evenly in all directions. It turns out the whole structure works like a giant passive amplifier. A sound system made of stone, but none of this was written down by its creators. There is no surviving blueprint, no ancient manual on sound design. Just results, just experience, just theater that worked. There's something profoundly beautiful about this kind of knowledge, a kind that isn't formulated, but felt. We often assume that science must come with formulas, charts, or footnotes, but sometimes it begins with intuition, with building and listening, changing and trying again. A kind of craftsmanship of attention. The Greeks didn't need to name decibels to know when sound carried. They didn't need wave equations to notice that voices rose better in a curve than on a flat plane. They didn't need a lab. They had a theater and a need to be heard. Epidaurus wasn't the only site with mysterious acoustic properties. In Delphi, in Dodona, and at Pergamon, temples and oracles stood in places where even nature seemed to whisper. The Oracle of Delphi, in particular, was located above a geological fault line. Some scientists now believe that subtle gases rising from the earth may have affected the priestess's states of mind, perhaps creating trance-like effects. But what's more interesting is how sound functioned in these places. In the sacred temple halls, echoes weren't just noise, they were divine. A repeated word was a sign, a lingering tone, a message. Sound was not only heard, it was interpreted. This blends religion with early science in a way we rarely allow today. But back then, there was no clear line between physics and prayer. The gods didn't speak directly. They spoke through wind and columns, tones and stones, songs sung by mortals. And so the Greeks listened. and built spaces that let them listen better. Spaces that helped even a god's whisper carry across thousands. In the next section, we'll follow this thread further into Pythagoras' music theory, the mathematics of harmony, and how sound became geometry you could hear. But for now, let this theater in your mind remain still. The audience quiet, the stone warm from sun, the distant cicadas buzzing in chorus. And in the center of the stage, a single voice rises, soft, steady, and clear. Not magic, not miracle, just architecture and attention. And that is a science all its own. Pythagoras, harmony, and the mathematics of sound. The Greeks didn't measure sound with instruments, not at first. They measured it with experience, with ritual, and later with strings. This is where Pythagoras enters the story. A figure as mysterious as he is famous, Pythagoras of Samos was born sometime around 570 BCE. He's remembered today as a mathematician. You might recall the right triangle theorem bearing his name. But in his own time, he was more than that. He was a mystic, a traveler, and possibly the founder of a secretive philosophical order where numbers weren't just tools. They were divine truths. And among all numbers, none spoke more clearly to him than those found in music. One day, at least according to legend, Pythagoras was walking past a blacksmith's shop. He noticed that the hammers striking the anvils rang out in different pitches, depending on their size and weight. Some combinations sounded pleasing, others jarring. He began to wonder, could there be a mathematical reason why some sounds harmonized and others clashed? This question would become his life's quiet obsession. He built a series of monochords, single-stringed, instruments stretched over a wooden soundbox. By adjusting the length of the string and plucking it, he discovered something remarkable. When a string was halved in length, the pitch produced was exactly 1 octave higher. Shorten it to 2/3, and you get a perfect fifth. 3/4, a perfect fourth. These were simple ratios: 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4. Whole numbers. And yet, they mapped directly to harmonious sound. This was more than music. It was a numerical language of the universe, expressed in tone. To Pythagoras and his followers, this wasn't just an interesting quirk. It was evidence that the cosmos, too, must follow hidden mathematical rules. That everything, from planetary motion to human behavior, might be explained through harmonies and ratios. They even believed in something called the music of the spheres, a kind of cosmic symphony produced by the movement of celestial bodies. We can't hear it, they said, because it has always been there. We are born into it. It was a comforting thought, that the universe was not chaotic, but harmonic, that it followed the same logic as a lyre's string. Whether or not Pythagoras invented these ideas himself, or absorbed them from earlier cultures, Egyptians, Babylonians, perhaps even India, he helped give them a structure, and like the builders of Epidaurus, he used observation and pattern to find a truth that echoed far beyond its origin. You might be wondering, if the Greeks discovered the math behind harmony, why didn't they build more sophisticated instruments or develop complex acoustic theories like later scientists did? The answer lies in their philosophy. To them, it was the purity of the ratio that mattered, not the mechanics of vibration, but the abstract relationship. Pythagoreans believed the soul was shaped by these proportions. Music wasn't entertainment, it was medicine, a tool for calming the spirit, ordering the mind, and even preparing the soul for death. Before bedtime, some Pythagorean communities were said to chant mathematical harmonies, not for joy, but for purification. This wasn't a performance. It was a ritual of cosmic tuning. Over time, the theories of Pythagoras influenced Plato, who wrote of music's power to shape character and morality. In Plato's Republic, education was to be based equally on gymnastics for the body and music for the soul. He, too, believed that certain scales built from clean ratios could uplift or corrupt. Some modes were noble and fortifying, others too emotional, dangerous, unruly. Music wasn't just art, it was ethics. And so sound became something more than sensation. It became structure, a way of organizing the self. These ideas didn't remain within the borders of Greece. In Alexandria, centuries later, Claudius Ptolemy wrote treatises on harmonic theory. In the Islamic world, philosophers like Al-Farabi and Avicenna expanded on Pythagorean ideas, integrating sound, medicine, and mathematics. Through medieval Europe and into the Renaissance, this fascination with the mathematics of music quietly hummed beneath grander scientific revolutions. When Johannes Kepler studied planetary orbits in the 17th century, he described their relationships using musical intervals, still haunted by the dream of celestial harmony. And yet, for all this lofty talk of ratios and philosophy, let's return to something more grounded. The temples, the walls, the echoes. It wasn't all about the stars. Sometimes, it was just about hearing a voice clearly in the open air. Consider this. Some ancient Greek temples had narrow niches in the walls, or domed ceilings that concentrated sound into a single point. One example is the Tholos of Epidaurus, circular temple near the theater, with subterranean chambers and curious acoustic features. Some archaeologists now believe these underground spaces weren't just storage, but may have been used to amplify or reflect sound during rituals. Could priests have used these chambers to create eerie, disembodied voices, echoes from below? A whispered reply to a desperate prayer? We don't know. But the possibility is intriguing. In an age without microphones or speakers, architecture was your amplifier. Sound wasn't engineered, it was invited. There's another subtle moment in Greek architecture that's worth noticing. Some buildings, especially those used for speeches or public gatherings, had carefully spaced columns and openings that helped diffuse sound evenly. In the Stoa of Attalos in Athens, a long colonnaded building used for commerce and dialogue voices could travel in conversation without being swallowed by echo or lost in wind. It may not seem like much, but in an age where persuasion was everything, the ability to be heard clearly was political power. And in that way, acoustics was not just an art or a science. It was a tool of democracy. The Greeks may never have called what they were doing acoustics. The term wouldn't be coined until the 17th century, from the Greek word acoustikos, meaning of or for hearing, but they practiced it all the same. In marble, in math, in music. And maybe, without realizing it, they began one of the oldest and quietest scientific traditions in history. In the final section of this story, we'll explore how this ancient obsession with harmony and echo faded, then re-emerged, centuries later, influencing everything from opera houses to physics labs. But for now, let the thought rest gently that the same string you pluck on a lyre is part of the same geometry that holds up a temple, and perhaps whispers through the stars how ancient Greek acoustics influenced modern sound design as the ancient Greek world faded into memory, its temples worn by time, its statues buried under soil and sea. Their ideas lingered in curious places, in fragments of scrolls, in the dusty libraries of early Christian monasteries, in the whispered traditions passed from one philosopher to the next. But the science of sound, if we can call it that, largely went silent for centuries. During the Middle Ages, music and architecture continued to evolve, of course. Gregorian chant rolled through vast cathedrals. Monks tuned their voices to match stone vaults. But the precise mathematical study of acoustics, so dear to the Pythagoreans, was forgotten, or at least dormant, until something shifted. Renaissance. A gentle awakening of sound. The Renaissance, with its reverence for antiquity, brought about a quiet rediscovery. Architects, inspired by Roman ruins and Greek ideals, began to rethink space. Musicians experimented with polyphony, multiple voices weaving together, and suddenly, The acoustics of buildings became more important than ever. You might imagine the dome of Florence's cathedral, designed by Brunelleschi, or the echoing chambers of Venice's San Marco Basilica, where composers like Gabrieli tested the spatial possibilities of sound by placing choirs in different balconies. One choir would sing from the left, another would answer from the right, and in the middle of it all, the listener would be cradled in harmonic architecture. It wasn't yet science in the modern sense, but it was, once again, a dialogue between space and sound. Echoes in enlightenment. Fast forward to the 17th and 18th centuries, and you'll find minds like Isaac Newton and Leonhard Euler beginning to study the physical properties of sound, its waves, its speed, its interaction with surfaces. Suddenly, acoustics wasn't just art or philosophy. It became physics. And then the real transformation began. Opera houses in Italy and France began to consider how to shape sound, not just decorate halls. In the Paris Opera House, built in the 19th century, architects consulted musicians to refine the theater's auditory balance. They built curved ceilings, layered balconies, and hidden panels to soften or amplify particular tones. Without fully realizing it, they were echoing the lessons of Epidaurus, of Pythagoras, of temples tuned not to gods, but to human voices. Birth of modern acoustics. The word acoustics, as we know it today, was first used systematically in the 1700s. But it wasn't until the late 19th century that it became a serious scientific discipline. The turning point came with a man named Wallace Sabine, a young physicist at Harvard University. He wasn't a musician. He wasn't an architect. He was simply curious, tasked with improving the echo problem in Harvard's lecture halls. Sabine began a series of painstaking experiments. Night after night, he and his team would move around chairs, cushions, and wall coverings, measuring how long sound lingered in the space after a clap or spoken word. He discovered that a room's reverberation, time how long a sound echoes, could be precisely calculated based on its size and the materials inside. From this, he derived the Sabine formula, still used today to design theaters, classrooms, and even subway stations. For the first time, humans could predict how sound would behave. In a space before it was built. Whispers in concrete and steel today. Acoustics is a subtle science that hides in plain sight. In every cinema, concert hall, podcast booth, or airport terminal, sound engineers use tools the Greeks could only have imagined: digital modeling, noise-canceling textures, subsonic dampeners. The goal is still ancient: to be heard clearly, to be understood, and sometimes to simply feel the sound without even noticing it. An auditorium's curved ceiling, a school's noise-absorbing walls, the placement of speakers in a silent museum room. All of it is the legacy of that first question: how does sound move? And, more poetically, can we shape a space to echo what matters most? Ghosts of the ancient theaters. There's a quiet irony in all this. With all our modern tools, our microphones, our reverbs, our editing software, nothing quite compares to the natural, effortless acoustics of the Greek theater at Epidaurus. Researchers have returned to that stone circle again and again, running experiments. One even fired a 9mm pistol at the center stage, only to find that the echo rippled through every tier, reaching the very last row with uncanny clarity. Still others have tested the way human breath, footfalls, or whispered verses travel through the marble tiers. And every time, the theater seems to outperform even the best. Digital acoustic simulators. We don't know exactly how the architects achieve this, whether through intuition, trial and error, or a deeply spiritual understanding of place. But perhaps that's part of the magic. Letting the silence speaks. So here we are. Thousands of years later, we've built concert halls in the shapes of eggs, waves, and shoeboxes. We've sent sound through cables under the ocean and bounced it off satellites in space. And yet, a single plucked string, stretched in a humble ratio, still brings peace. A human voice, rising in a stone amphitheater, still stirs the soul. The Greeks didn't invent sound, but they taught us to listen, to feel the way space shapes story. And in that way, they gave us something that isn't just a science or an art. They gave us a way to understand the invisible. And so this story, like sound itself, slowly fades. Not with a bang, but with an echo. The kind that lingers in the air long after the voice is gone. Let it drift with you now into quiet sleep. A whisper of marble, a trace of music, and the still, soft hum of an ancient world that never truly fell silent.